we wanted to talk a little bit here about ways in which the visual system is so important in how we learn and in being able to learn faster and to work smarter. So sometimes we think about how we memorize things. How do we remember what we're trying to learn? And certainly some of that can be visual, sometimes it's auditory, but I'm going to go through a couple of things here that we have used in our vision therapy program that has really taught children and adults ways in which they can learn more quickly. And talking about ways in which we remember things, both we know auditorily and we know visually, but I'm going to talk about some things visually that I think are important. So they say that memory is like a muscle. The more it's used, the better it gets. But I'm going to suggest that there are ways to remember things that you can use that will allow you to remember without necessarily going over the material continuously. And we do know that if we memorize things or if we learn things effectively, we are more efficient and we will be able to perform, whether it's studying for a test, memorizing lines, just being given some important information, even if we only have to remember it for a short time. Certainly, I know that I struggle some to remember people's names, and I've learned some techniques to help with that. But there are many things we have to remember today, almost overload. Phone numbers, I'm not sure we have to remember as much. As I used to say to my mom, you know, it's just going in and hitting a button rather than remembering the number. But we do often have to remember passwords. And there are other times when you don't have quick access to the information, so it helps that you have it in your head, so to speak. Now, when we say using your whole mind to remember, we know that mnemonics can be helpful. I don't know how many of you have used them. I know that I learned some certainly in school. I know that we often will make up our own mnemonics, and it does seem to help us remember, especially if it's short. So we know that if we want to remember something and memorize it in a way that it goes from short-term memory into more long-term memory, that we can do it by thinking about images, maybe color, if you remember a certain sound at the time that you learned it, smells, taste, spatial awareness, even our emotions at the time, and certainly there is the language side. But we also know that symbols alone can give us more complex messages quickly and effectively. So when we do talk about vision, we talk about it being more simultaneous processing, because if I look at a sign, I often don't even have to read all the words on the sign to know exactly what it means, because I have that image to go by. Whereas if I have to describe it to someone, that's going to be more sequential, and that's the language side of things. So when they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, it truly is. If you can have a picture in your mind, it will often help you to remember things more effectively, more efficiently, more quickly than if you had to describe each stage and step of what you wanted to remember. So it's not that language is unimportant, it's just that vision, again, is more simultaneous and faster. So one of the things that can be helpful is creating some type of association. And that can be on the visual side or the language side. So if you can't remember a person's name easily, maybe when you look at them, you remind yourself of some feature of their face or a particular outfit they were wearing at the time, or even the setting in which you met them, so that you can bring that image up in your mind and it will help you to remember their name. Sometimes it's not always an image, it can be language. You may give them a particular name that reminds you of them. But we do know that imagery is very, very important. And if we can connect to something physical, that can be a picture, that can be a place, that certainly can be a smell or a color, but we know that it really helps us to remember things more easily. And whenever you're working with someone, I'm going to show you something in a little while that really can help learning information, especially new information, that may be easier than just reading it and trying to make the imagery from reading it. You may have to do it on a more top-down basis, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Now, in this particular slide, I did put something that has been talked about, which is if you're trying to remember a list, maybe you want to associate the items together by giving them some kind of an unusual name. So if you're thinking about corn and bananas and milk, you might make a funny word that you remember. But I also know that if, as each word is said, you make a picture of that in your mind, you're much more likely to be able to go back, call up those pictures, and be able to recite the list. Now, repetition is not unimportant. We know that when it comes to vision or language or whatever way we're using to remember things, that if we repeat something over and over, we certainly find that we remember it better, or we're ending up using an interconnection between different senses. So for example, if an athlete is going to perfect their skill, initially they may say to themselves, I need to take a step and put my arm back and reach up high for a ball, but that's going to be very slow. And then as they practice it, they get more muscle memory, and that's certainly another way that it becomes more automatic for them to do it as soon as they see a ball coming toward them. I also know, though, that if they repeat it as imagery in their mind, that they will be much more successful. I know that many years ago I saw a movie, and I don't remember exactly what it was about, but there was a race car driver, and he talked about the fact that before every race, he would walk the track and really imagine himself going along that track, of course, at very high speed, and that helped him be much more successful and safe when he was in the actual race. And I think that's another form of using that visualization. We know that we can only hold a small number of pieces of information in our short-term memory. We know that, for example, telephone numbers are, 7 to 10 numbers, because after that, it becomes hard to hold on to that. But if we could picture those numbers, we may be able to have even more of them and be able to not only see them, but if we were presented with them over and over and over again, but in a flash basis, similar to using flashcards, but even faster than that, if you were putting them, for example, in a PowerPoint presentation and you set it so that in less than a second, each image would come up, it turns out that we can identify that information much more quickly, and we then get to keep that picture in our mind so that we have that information to use. Certainly, there are some other tips here that can be helpful. Breaking things down rereading, especially out loud, because now you have the visual and the auditory connected. We know that flashcards can help, and I know that we use something called tachistoscopic flashing, which is we take information and we can put it in a PowerPoint slide, we can put it in a computer program that can do it, but what it does is it flashes the information at 125th of a second. And you will find that if you practice that, you may only be able to do, let's say we put numbers up. You may be only able to remember 2 or 3 numbers or 4 numbers in the beginning, but as you practice, pretty soon I could be showing you 6 or 7 numbers, and you would have no trouble, even in that very short span, of remembering them once the image went away. Now, I know that acronyms can be helpful, but you have to remember them in terms of not only the language side, but it can be the visual side as well. I know that when I often have to remember things, I may have an acronym in mind, but I also see it in my mind. And that helps me think about each letter as I'm going to think about what each letter means. So for example, if we talk about the colors of the rainbow, you may know that they're Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. But if you remembered the Roy G. Biv, how are you going to keep in mind each of those letters individually so that you can have the time to go through and say what each color is? And I lay odds that for most of us, we remember those letters as if we were seeing them written on a board. It's in our mind, but as we think about seeing each letter, we then remember what it's connected to. Now, one of the things that we all need to do is if there's anything getting in the way of our trying to learn something new or trying to remember something, we really do need to try to get the clutter out and keep a positive mental attitude. If you see progress, you're more likely to stick with it. You always want to do what is most challenging when not only are you at your mental best, but when you're well rested. And I have had the opportunity to talk with some leaders of various departments in companies. And when I talk with them, I say, look, when you know that something is likely to be challenging for the people who are working for you, you don't give it to them at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they quit at 5 o'clock. You want to give that to them first thing in the day when they're better rested, probably and hopefully having eaten, having had enough hydration, and when they are more fresh and can really think it through. If you wait and give them something that is very challenging after they've had maybe a particularly challenging day, then it's going to be much harder for them to get through it. They likely won't remember it in the same way, and you'll be at square one again, for example, if you're trying to teach them a new way of doing something. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about here is how can we use visualization as a way of processing information more quickly, because we said a picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, these pictures are probably copyrighted. They're from an older book, although there are some newer versions that people have come out with. And these are pictures that are meant to teach us the names of the first 10 presidents on this page, and I have more pages to show you more. And I will tell you that I have used this with children who don't know the presidents and who not only can tell me it when we're finished doing the exercise, which I will show you in a minute, but sometimes months go by and I will have an encounter with them and they'll say, oh, I want to tell you the presidents. I remember the presidents. Sometimes we've even seen where it can be a few years that has gone by, and they'll still remember it because they can call up the picture in their mind. And so if you look at this picture, and again, these are older images, I'm sure someone could modernize them a bit. But if we look at the first 10 presidents here, we have Washington, because you see the washing, and you have 2,000 pounds is a ton. And then Adams, because of an Adam's apple. And then Jefferson. So it's Chefferson or Jefferson. And then Madison, mad at the sun. And then we have Monroe, a man rowing. And if you go back again, just so that you're familiar enough with it. So we have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then there's another Adams, and then Jackson, this is a Van and a Bureau, Van Buren. I'd say for a lot of kids, they don't know the word bureau, so we have to teach that to them. But once they get it, they hold on to it. And then you have Harrison, like a hairy son, Harrison, and Tyler. This is a worker carrying a group of tiles. So if we go through it just once more, we have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, and Tyler. Now, if you study the picture for a minute or so, and I'll speak a little bit while you're doing that, I want you to think about really remembering the pictures, not the words, just the pictures. And then I want you to close your eyes and see if you can name those first presidents by remembering the pictures. And these are just the first 10. And believe me, there was a time in my life I really didn't know the presidents at all, and now I can remember them much more easily because I call up these pictures every time I want to think about it. It's not perfect. I don't always get it 100% if I haven't looked at it in a while, but it certainly is an opportunity to do it in a way that all you're calling up is one image and it's giving you 10 names. Whereas if you saw them written down and you tried to memorize that list, I think it would be much more challenging. And if someone just told them to you a few times and you wanted to memorize them, it would be much more challenging. But a picture is truly worth 1,000 words. So I know you can't speak to me while we're doing this, but I hope that you've been able to really see that you can keep an image in your mind, and while you have that image, you can remember the names. So I'm going to go through a few more. I kept to what were generally not the most modern presidents here so that I wasn't showing you the whole book because there is some copyright, I'm sure, to it. But this was actually developed by a gentleman who was a basketball player. And when he retired from basketball, he had a real interest in how we remember things. And at the time, he wrote a number of books, how we can remember some math facts, faces, the presidents. And while certainly some of the images could be modernized a bit, I do know that it's a really effective way to help a student and to help yourself remember things that are not so easy. So when we get to this page, Tyler we already saw, and now we get to the next group, and that next group is Polk, polka dots. And then Taylor, so you see a Taylor here. And then Fillmore, this gentleman is filling his pockets more and more. And then you can see the needle through the cannon there, and that's for Pierce. And then the blue cannon stands for Buchanan. Then you have the Lincoln car for Lincoln. And then yawning at the sun is for Johnson. Granite, the stone, for Grant. Hay for Hayes. And then the car in the field is meant to represent Garfield. So we have Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, and Garfield. Again, if you take a few moments to look at the picture and remember the pictures, not necessarily the words, just the pictures, and then you look away or close your eyes, I'll bet that you can now get 10 more presidents. And then when we move on again, we have the gentleman at the beginning there, and that is for Arthur. Excuse me, Arthur. And then the two cleavers at the bottom represent Cleveland. And then Harrison, Harry's son. And then the kindling is McKinley. And then the rose is Roosevelt. The taffy is Taft. The will standing on the sun is Wilson. And then the ink bottle with the person or the bottle banging itself would be Harding, or like hard ink, Harding. And then the ice on the bottom of the shelf there would be Coolidge. So again, you have Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, and Cleveland. And again, you can try looking at it for a bit. Usually I say a few seconds for each picture. And then if you look away or close your eyes, you may even be able to not only remember this page, but perhaps the previous two pages. And the last part here, I didn't do all the presidents. This one is, you see Coolidge that we talked about at the end of the previous one. And then Hoover, because of the Hoover vacuum, and it says Hoover on it. Then you have Roosevelt again. Then Truman is Truman. Eyes on the tower is Eisenhower. The can of D's is Kennedy. And I stopped there because the book only went a little bit further because of the time when it was written, but I know that there are some books, and if not books, there are certainly some individual images on the internet for that some people have put up that they've made for some of the more modern presidents. And actually, when I was doing and working with students, what I would have them do is they often knew some of the more modern presidents, and we would give them those names and say, look, we don't have any pictures for them. Can you make your own pictures that you can remember? And so we would let them make images that sometimes we would even use with others, and we would have them look at it, take it away, and then see if that really did help them to remember more of the presidents. So I'm just going to go back for a moment, and hopefully looking at it, you can certainly remember what they stand for. And then, again, do you have enough of that picture in your mind to be able to remember them without the picture being there? And I think that one of the things that we always try to do is not only the fact that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and having the picture gives you a lot of information and is not sequential like language, but also, if you are using it, if you keep them in front of you all the time, you really have to try and make it as if you were taking a picture of the picture, and then when you take it away, that picture is in your mind. And that's how I used to describe it to kids. I would say, you know how to take a picture. Take a picture of it in your mind and see if you can't hang on to that. And we had students who would come in week after week and want to recite the presidents because they were so proud of themselves. And one time I had a little girl who was in the 2nd grade, and the teacher made some reference to some number president, and the little girl blurted it out, and the teacher was very surprised that she actually knew some of the presidents, but she had learned it from these pictures. So it's a very effective way of helping students learn through vision in a way that they can process information much more efficiently, much more quickly, much more easily. So I'm going to show you these again, just go through them. And then I wanted to kind of bring up here, when we're talking about remembering what we see, we know that visual attention would be important. And I know that you often work with students who have difficulty with reading. And I wanted to just talk about it a little bit in terms of the importance of aspects of vision, visual attention, visual perception for reading, and why some of these things may be impediments to someone becoming a more fluent reader and also not having good reading comprehension. So reading is difficult for a lot of reasons. One is there's really no set reading center in the brain. We know that reading involves visual information. There's an auditory or language component. And when someone is reading, it's really important that they are able to take in more than just one word at a time. And in the visual system, we have an area of more central looking called the parvocellular system. And that's the part where you see something very sharply. It's a very small part of the retina of the eye and a very small part of the information that goes to the visual part of the brain. But it's important so that something can be clear enough to identify it. But what allows us to get to that place is being able to notice what's coming next and know how we want to move our eyes so that we land in the proper place in order to make sense of the information. And so that aspect, some people call it our peripheral visual system, but it's the part of the visual system that is very active and responds much more to motion. It doesn't have very good ability for detail. But if someone has impaired magnocellular development or use of their magnocellular system, we often find that the ability to use the eyes together is unstable, and they can be visually confused because their eyes are not landing in the correct place at the correct time. We know also that you can have impaired auditory development and there can be phonological confusion. But we also know that when we talk about motor development, while it affects speech and it affects handwriting, a big piece of that is vision or visual motor ability. So, what are some of the things that reading requires? Well, you have to rapidly identify the letters, even if you're a good reader. That's why when I talked earlier about tachistoscopic flashing things at a fast rate so that you identify them very, very quickly, that is one of the ways that we sometimes try to help someone who may have difficulty reading text that is connected, meaning sentences or words on a full page, but certainly can identify individual letters or words. You can do something called rapid serial visual presentation, or RSVP. And in fact, there was an app out there for a while that said, you know, if you have a lot of email to read, maybe this is an easier way to read your email. And it would show one or two words at a time and just go rapidly through the text of an email so that you could take it in more quickly and more efficiently. But we know that if someone is going to identify letters, they also have to get them in the right order. They then have to translate that into sound. And we know that there are more aspects of how we understand the parts that make up words and how they get divided. But without going into all of that as a reading lesson, let's just say here that if you can rapidly identify what you're looking at, know where to go next with your eyes, and land in the correct place to pick up the next piece of information, and you can do that orderly without losing your place and in a reasonable amount of time, then you will be more fluent and likely have better comprehension. So I apologize that when I was using PowerPoint online, it decided that I wanted some of these effects. But if we look at adults, and many adults have reading issues, it turns out that 20% of adults really can't even find a simple word in the yellow pages. Now, we know that that's not books of pages anymore, that a lot of it is online. But if you're going to go through information quickly to get to where you need to, you have to know the alphabet, you have to know the order, you have to be aware when you see one word, whether the word you're really looking for will come before that or after that, however you're picking up that information. And there still are books and texts out there that people look at for these things. We also know that a high percentage of children and adults who have been in some kind of detention situation or criminal situation have reading issues. I was part of a study many, many years ago where we looked at children who were in detention for various crimes, not major crimes, but certainly enough that they were being held in a detention center. And we found that a very high percentage of them had reading issues. Not all of them had true reading disability, and the term dyslexia is not necessarily defined the same by everyone, but certainly we knew that some of them had reading disability, but we also found that quite a few of them didn't have the best visual skills and abilities to bring to the task, and that when we were able to help them, both in the study I was part of, but also looking at other studies that have been done, the incidence of recidivism, the rate at which those same young people ended up back in the criminal system, was significantly less. And we know that there are often college students who still have some of these same difficulties. If you can see clearly, but no one has taken the time to help identify the fact that you are not using the visual system in the way it was designed in order to know where to move your eyes, how to move them, where to land, in a way that is so automatic that your attention and resources can really be moved to the material itself, then it's just going to follow you. It's not going away just because you've managed to get to a certain place. And I think what happens is, for someone who's smart or has figured out ways around their difficulty, what we do see happen is that they manage for a pretty long period of time. And then when they're in late high school or early college, or sometimes even when they start a job that requires them learning a lot of new material, it really comes out, because they're smart enough that if they went to class and they listened well, maybe they didn't need to read too much material to get through what they needed to. But once they hit some wall, whenever that is, they found that without the proper visual skills and abilities, they were really falling behind. Now, I don't want to actually define the term dyslexia because not everyone defines it the same way. But I will say that overall, most people can agree that if someone has an IQ that you believe is not an impediment to their becoming a good reader or speller, then what you'll notice is that their performance is below what you'd expect based on their age and their IQ. We do know that some of those students have what might be called more of a language issue, in the sense that they do not hear the sounds the same way most of us do when they are learning words. But we also know that a percentage cannot reread words that they know and have learned, because once those words become more involved in connected text, it becomes much harder for them. And as a part of that, we know that a certain percentage of students who have some type of reading disability may have unstable visual skill. They may have some visual confusion. I know that in the past they've talked about mixed-handedness, so that there's supposedly more left-right confusion. I think that's kind of been debunked, that it doesn't really make a difference if you have mixed-handedness. But we do know that when the spelling is poor, while there may be some language aspect to it, I will tell you that when I have to spell a word, I visualize it. And I can tell you that if I write a word down and I'm not spelling it correctly, I know that because it doesn't look right. And it is necessary in terms of overall spelling, because if you have to do it a different way, it's likely to be less efficient and the speed of processing is going to be much less. Now, what do we know about students who have what in this study was considered dyslexia in terms of vision? Well, we know that they have smaller magnocellular cells, so the part of that visual system that allows for you to know where you're going to look next and where you're going to land with your fixation, so that things will become clear. They have less activity in visual motion areas that relate to some of the same eye movements. We do know that there can be some issues in language areas as well. But we also know that when we look at visual evoked potentials, which are a way of looking at how much latency is there and what's the strength of the signal as we are shown different patterns, that their latency is greater and or the amplitude is not what it should be. So when there's input from our eyes, it's relayed ultimately to the primary visual cortex, which is at the back of the brain. But that's not where things stop. It has to go to other visual areas. It has to link with auditory processing so that you get both the visual and auditory forms of words and their meaning. And there is projection to speech areas. But I can tell you that it kind of goes both ways. I know that when I see a child who has improved speech patterns, it's likely aspects of their visual processing will be better. I also have seen that when we've worked on aspects of basic eye movements and processing of visual information, that all of a sudden speech is better. So what are some of the overlaps or comorbidities? We know that many times when someone has been diagnosed with a reading disability, they may have other conditions. I think that there's no hard and fast line here. I think that if there's a predominance of certain symptoms, you certainly can give someone a diagnosis, and we know that it's important sometimes for a diagnosis for someone to get treatment or if they're in school to get services. But understand that all these things have to kind of play nicely together. So if your eye movements are unsteady, if your visual attention is impacted in some way, it's certainly going to have some effect in the auditory system as well. Not because the visual is affecting the auditory, but it turns out that the same sort of magnocellular process that we talk about in vision, there is right next to the visual areas of the brain involved, the same basic structure for the auditory system. We also know that if you have dyspraxia, there are issues with how you motor plan and how you then are able to execute movements and be coordinated in those movements. And I can tell you that if we understand that one of the aspects that's important in terms of why the visual system exists is not only that we take in visual information, but that vision is an output system and that it has a role in aligning or assisting with our body movements, then we'll understand that working on visual aspects will have a positive effect on motor planning. And again, while there are many aspects to why someone may have some kind of inattention, we do know that if they can take more information in more quickly, more efficiently, certainly connect it with information coming in through their other sensory systems, that then they will be able to attend longer. And we know that a lot of this is certainly directly and indirectly caused by impaired development of the magnocellular system. Again, there is a similar system in the auditory, on the auditory side, but we do know that we take in information more simultaneously through vision, where language is more sequential. So I have had many, many students tell me that letters and words appear to move on the page. You need to have enough time, even though it's a short time, to be able to fixate on a word and know where it is spatially so that you have the time to process it. If your visual system is not telling you where you need to be and can't hold you there long enough to process the information, then things are going to look kind of jumbled up, or they're going to move around on the page because of the magnocellular system, not because you don't have the ability to fixate. And even though words can only be identified during very brief fixations, it's still relatively a long time in terms of the visual process if you don't have the ability to do that. So we know that about 10% of what are called retinal ganglion cells are magnocellular, and they detect, like I said earlier, visual motion. They direct our attention. It controls our eye movements and ultimately enables us to have steady fixation because we understand the area around where we're trying to look, and we are able to then hold that fixation. We also know that if you are fixating on something, but that magnocellular system is not allowing you to notice what's around where you're trying to look, so that it's like tunnel vision. It's like putting binoculars in front of your eyes and trying to identify things. You know that if you're at, for example, a football game, and you pick up a pair of binoculars, anything you see through those binoculars is very clear, but you don't have a good sense of the entire game because you're just getting a very small piece of information. And if you had to move those binoculars around continuously in order to pick up all the information, it still may be difficult to then put that information together in a coherent way. And that's what it's like for a lot of students that have reading issues. If their visual system is picking up information, but in small chunks, not really understanding how it all fits into what's around where they're trying to look, then they will not have a good sense of the material, meaning that they will not have fluent reading and they won't have very good reading comprehension. The other is the magnocellular system is a much faster system than fixation. And that makes sense because if you have to identify something and put all the pieces together and hold it for a long enough time to process it, it's going to be slower. And if you need to know where to move your eyes next so that you're safe or you can identify more words, then at that moment in time, you need a faster system. One of the demonstrations I sometimes talk about is, if I pick up a brick and it's brown and I'm about to throw it at your head, you don't really care that it's a brown brick. You don't care whether it's perfectly formed or has little dimples in it. What you need to know in a split second is how to get out of its way. That's where the magnocellular system shines. If you want to know more information about the brick, it would be really helpful if it stopped moving and you could then take the time to notice the details of it. But in life, the system that's most important is the one that allows us to notice motion and react quickly. Then we can turn our heads, fixate for as long as we need to make sense of the information. But in the short run, we need a system that lets us know where are we looking, where do we want to go next with our eyes, and how quickly do we need to do that. So again, we said that the magnocellular system, in those that have certain reading disabilities, they have seen that the cells are smaller. There has been a time when they've done some studies and found that there is delayed motion evoked brainwaves, and there's a lower sensitivity to visual motion, and that's what is involved with that system. That system does not react well to sight or to detail. It doesn't have the ability for that. It primarily is involved with noticing motion and then turning our heads in order to make sense of whatever the details are. And when we measure aspects of it, we do see that there's reduced activation in the part of the brain where visual information, once it hits the visual cortex, then moves on to. And then contrast sensitivity is the ability to identify detail from background. So for example, if you have black print on a white background, that's considered very high contrast. If you have black print on a dark blue background, you know that that's harder to read because the contrast on the page is not very good. But we can measure in ourselves contrast sensitivity, and when it's lower, we have more difficulty, again, picking out the detail from the background. And therefore, we're slower at directing our visual attention, and we do know that many of these students have unstable control of using the eyes together. So let's think about this for a second. If you have the word rain, R-A-N-E, and you have the word rain, R-A-I-N, which is the proper spelling? You really can't do it by understanding the sound at that point because they sound the same. You have to have a memory of its orthography, or the way that the letters form the word. You can't solve it by sounding out the letters. And it turns out that if you do this simple test with 10-year-old children, it turns out to be a very good predictor of reading skill. Now, we know there's lots of different tests out there, and lots of things that have been said can be connected to how someone is going to do both from an early age to a later age, from a later age to being an adult. But I can tell you that there are several visual tests that have been done that can at least say that someone may be at risk of not having good reading skill or not being able to do certain kinds of activities easily based on how they perform on some very simple tests that can be done at young ages. And we know that one of the things here is that this magnocellular system, or the motion sensitivity aspect of it, can predict this kind of performance. And in about a fifth of people, the differences between their orthographic reading, or their orthographic reading ability, can just be explained by the fact that their visual motion sensitivity isn't what it should be. This magnocellular system is very important to developing that orthographic skill. So why would it have an impact on reading? Well, a lot of people think that dyslexia, however you define it, is primarily language-based and involves poor phonological skill. But we do know that there can be visual issues as well as auditory processing problems. And I can tell you that I have had students that I've worked with where we do certain screening tests, and we find that although they're losing their place when they're reading, it appears to have a stronger language base than a visual base. And yet, when I work with them and we improve their visual skills and abilities, we find that although they may still have some reading difficulty, they are doing much better than they had been. And I think that's one of the things that we don't always pay enough attention to, and I'm probably guilty of that as well, which is when we see someone who has a deficit, we find ourselves often putting our effort and attention toward the deficit and not always thinking about building up the aspects that are already strong, but probably aren't as strong as they could be because the intersection or interaction of these skills has not been available to them. And so as a result, if we take someone and we work on the weak skills, but we also spend time improving what to them are stronger skills, we're likely to have a better result. And we know that children who have visual issues, not necessarily eyesight problems, but issues in this magnocellular function, they do tell us that letters tend to blur, jump around, and they sometimes also mix up the letter sounds, whether that is a separate issue or because the two things have to come together. I can't tell you that, but I will tell you that once we stabilize things for them, they do much better. I'm just going to put this whole thing out here and then tell you a little more about it. So, when things hit the eye, they don't stay solid. For example, if you're looking at something, it may seem like it's not moving to you, but that image on your retina has to move a little bit. If it doesn't, it turns out the image will disappear. But if there's too much slip, then you get a feedback to your eye movements, and your eye movements get this message, oh, we have to steady our eye fixation a little bit more. And then things visually will be more stable, in which case we will identify letters in the proper order, and we will now have better orthographic skill. So I know that we often talk about reversals in reading, and I think there's two aspects. One is if I take a letter and I write it what is essentially backward, that is a flipping of the image, but it may be in the correct place in the word, versus when we write the letters out of order. And so I think we need to think about them as not the same thing, although sometimes we use the same words to describe it. But in this case, what we know is that if there is a bit of slip to the retinal image, we get feedback to steady our eye fixation. You get better visual stability to identify letters in order, and therefore it strengthens the orthographic skill. These are some of the kinds of things that kids and even some adults say when they have what may be a visual reading problem. They say letters go blurry, they move, they float, they move in and out of the page. Sometimes they actually go double. I've had someone tell me that a letter looks like it moves over on top of another letter. And so they couldn't really tell, was it a C, was it an R? And they do have difficulty with B's and D's and P's and Q's. Or they say, I keep losing my place. Now again, it can look like someone is losing their place, and many times you will think of that as some kind of oculomotor issue. If you do the right kind of screening, you may find that while there is some visual component to it, it appears to be more language-based. And if that's true, it doesn't mean, though, that you can't work on the visual side as well to strengthen skill enough that the person's performance will be improved. Doesn't mean they're going to go out and be the best reader in the class, but it does mean that they will be able to handle more material, hopefully be more efficient, and hopefully have an improvement in their comprehension. So when we think of visual motor function, I know some people think of visual motor like handwriting. But it turns out that you have to move your eyes as well as utilize the ability of the eyes to work together. So if you have unsteady binocular fixation, you're going to get an unsteady or unstable perception of things. If your pursuit or saccadic eye movements are jerky or poor, it's going to be challenging to get things to come to you in the right order. If you can't use the two eyes together, and that's what vergence is. When we read the two eyes turn inward toward the print, that's called convergence. Again, if that's not working well, it's a visual motor function that will certainly have an impact on our performance. We also know that in terms of higher level visual processing, it may be harder for someone to do some type of mental rotation. Sometimes if we ask them to localize where dots are on a page, they have difficulty. We do know that they can lose their place even following vertically, in which case there is often a conclusion that it has more of a language component, and it may have a predominance of language componency to it, but it certainly can be improved with visual input or the opportunity to strengthen visual skill. And visual search is a problem in the sense that when we look at things, think about proofreading something. You may find that you can go through it very quickly and things that are not right pop out. I know that I can be a pretty good proofreader because it just seems like as I go across the page, if something isn't right, it acts like it pops out at me as if it were in bold print. That's not necessarily true for everyone, and some people can have it more strongly. I had someone working for me at one time who had excellent skill to do that. So anytime I needed something proofed or had to find something on a page, I would give it to them because they could do it even faster than I could. But there's something inherent in being able to move your eyes in the proper order and in the proper way, going in English left to right and then coming back left and going along the next line, and being able to just do that along with the fact that when something is out of order or not improper spelling or some mistake on the page, that immediately that imagery pops out so that you realize from an imagery standpoint, not a language standpoint, that it's not okay. Now, it turns out that in a random controlled trial that was done, that in 3 months' time, reading was able to be increased by 6 months in a certain group of students. And it was because they did a lot of visual fixation exercises. And when we say the word fixation, it has to do with actually holding our fixation. It has to do with pursuits and saccades and looking at something and knowing where to go next with our eyes. They said in the study that if these students had reading assistance, they would have only gained 9 months in 18 months. And that in general, if they have phonics-based remediation, it achieves 1 month per month as opposed to 2 months per month with these fixation exercises. Now, that doesn't mean you substitute one for the other, but it may mean that you need a combination of input in order to help someone achieve the kind of levels that you're looking to have them achieve. We talked about the fact that you have to converge your eyes for near vision. And it turns out that that vergence eye movement system is pretty vulnerable. For example, if you have too many drinks, sometimes you'll see double because the two eyes just don't want to do the same thing at the same time. But it is dominated by the magnocellular system because you need to have that sense of where are you looking, but what also is around what where you're looking. And if you do that and you help someone by working with activities that have an effect on that magnocellular system, you will find that you can give them better vergence eye movement control. And in students that have particular reading disabilities, they have seen that many of them have unstable vergence control. Now, what about filters, which you may have heard about? It does turn out that for some students, using certain color filters does help them process the information better. It doesn't mean that there isn't still an underlying visual issue. In fact, there were a couple of good studies done that said, yes, if we give someone certain kind of tinted lenses, or we put a special filter on top of the reading page, that they do better. But if we examine them, we find they still have an underlying visual issue, and they could be doing even better if we were to address that. But it does turn out that yellow filters are sometimes helpful in terms of having someone looking at the material and saying, you know what, it looks like there's more space between the letters, between the words, more space between each line of print, and I can now get through the material more quickly, more easily, more efficiently. My processing speed is going to go up, and hopefully then that also translates to better comprehension. In some cases, we found that blue filters can be helpful, and we do find that 10% of those with certain reading disability have weak blue input to the magnocellular system, and they often complain of glare along with letters moving around. And it turns out that blue filters can sometimes improve their reading ability. Again, these aren't magic. They're not for everyone. You're not going to get the same response. But if you have an opportunity to put an overlay over reading material and it can help someone, I would say do it. But understand that that's not the end. That's only the beginning of trying to help them. The other is that when I have someone who's having difficulty, at least in the early stages, what I might suggest is, one, that we make the reading material more narrow. So instead of a whole wide page of reading, I might take material and make it digital, and then make wide margins so they don't have to scan over as large an area. And the other thing that's been very helpful is making the space between each line of print 1.5 times the font size. So if they're reading, for example, 12-point font, then we ask them to make the space between each line of print 18-point. And what happens is that in most, for example, word processing programs, the spacing is about equal to the font size, or maybe 1.1 times the font size, but it's never 1.5. But you can go in and change that in a lot of programs. Some of you probably have seen where, like, if you have an e-reader like a Kindle, that it will allow you to make the space between the lines closer together or a bit farther apart. And for some people, that makes a big difference. Also, the font itself, because we do find that if they are less busy fonts, that it makes it easier for many people. There also is a font out there, at least one, if not two, that have been developed specifically for people who have a specific reading disability. I can't tell you how well they work because I don't get the effect of that, and I haven't tried it with enough patients, but I will say that it's certainly worth trying. I believe that they're free and can be imported into a word processing program so they can use it. And it may very well help some students. Again, if we give someone these colored filters, it may correct some imbalance to the magnocellular system. Sometimes we find that we can take it away and they do seem to be doing better. A lot of times, though, they need it there on a continuous basis until we've had an opportunity to work on more of the overall visual skills and visual processing. Generally, other colors don't help as much, although, again, my go-to is generally yellow, blue, occasionally sort of an amber color, but that's primarily if they've had some kind of insult or injury to their brain. And other colors have been shown to help some students, but if I could only pick a couple of them to try, I would say yellow and blue have probably had the most effect. Sometimes I've used more of a blue-green rather than just a blue, and the blue is pretty light, a blue, but a blue-green has also been good. I don't find that, at least for the most part, that we go to too many other colors. So I think what's important here is just understanding the role of this visual magnocellular system, and that anything we can do to help someone acquire information more quickly, more easily, more efficiently, that it will help them in terms of improving reading. We also know from the first part of what I talked about that having a picture of what is happening is very different than even a picture of a word. And maybe it relates to the fact that we learn from the concrete to the more abstract. You know, a child will know what something is even when they see it because they've handled it at some point in time. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be in the room. For example, if I say the word apple to you, you can have a picture of an apple, and maybe one person's is red and one person's is green. I lay odds that you all have some relative idea of its size. You may even find that you've taken your hand and put your hand in kind of a letter C, as if you were going to handle an apple, and you have a sense of its texture and its taste, and it's not even in the room. And the reason is because your visual system becomes the way that we touch the world when we can't physically touch it. Once something is beyond the end of your hand or the end of your arm when it's outstretched, you need something else to touch what's out there in order to gather that information. And that becomes the visual system, but generally you have to have handled it already in a way that you've touched it so that it becomes something that you understand. For example, if I've never seen a kiwi fruit and someone says kiwi, I have no picture. I have no idea. Is it big? Is it small? Is it rough? Is it smooth? What does it taste like? You know, what color is it? I don't have any of that. But if I've seen one even once and had a chance to taste it, I'll have that information. So we need to go from that concrete to the more abstract. And sometimes you may find yourself working with students that haven't had much of an opportunity to have those experiences. And so maybe you have to start with things being more concrete before you can go to the abstract. We do know that colored filters can help, and we do know that some patients can be helped when there is some kind of binocular interference. And we know that because in some cases, if we patch one eye, some students actually do better because we've taken away that interference. I would not suggest that you do that. I would not suggest that that's the way we want someone to read, but we do know that we can show that binocular interference when we patch one eye. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sure there may be questions, and I hope that was helpful on some level and makes you think about activities and things you may bring to those you work with. And I'm open to questions.
All right, great. Yeah, we have a couple in here. So the first question goes back to those President's books that you were showing. We have questions about the reference, or how do we know what books those were?
Yes, I can look it up while I'm talking with you. Is there another question while I'm doing that?
Yes, we have. So I have an 8-year-old client with autism and ADHD, and they say the spelling correctly, but often switch the letters when actually writing the words. Usually just 2 letters and the word are switched. What do you think is causing this disconnect?
So they're switching letters within a word.
Yeah, so it looks like they're spelling correctly, but they switch the letters when they actually write the word. So they're saying the spelling correctly, but they're switching the letters when they are writing.
Yeah, I mean, if you can say it correctly, that's fine, but you may need to somehow have the picture of it. And a lot of times, again, on that visualization side, what I do is have them imagine it. I may have them write it in the air a few times. Actually, before that, I may even have them write it on like a chalkboard or a whiteboard correctly. Then I have them stand back and write it in the air. Then I have them close their eyes and try to imagine it. And when I have them imagining it with their eyes closed, it's not to write it in the air. It's for me to say, maybe what's the first letter, what's the last letter, what's the middle letter, what's the letter after A or O, so that they have such a good sense of it in terms of picturing it, that then when they go to write it, they will hopefully bring up that picture. Or if they write it incorrectly, they will recognize the error and change it.
All right. What is an example of the fixation exercises?
Well, fixation is the ability to hold our looking on something. And if that's unstable, I would say that you don't just say to somebody, look at this and try to hold it. We have ways, for example, of creating markers that that you can notice that are marking the retina of the eye. And so it turns out that there are some cells in the retina that if you have a rotating motor and a light that in a special device, that it creates what looks a little like the propellers of an old airplane. And when you see that, you know you're using that particular area of the retina, which is for fixation. And so we can work with someone by creating that image for them and then asking them to place it on things that they're looking at. I can start with something simple like dots. I can then move on to letters or numbers. I can have them spaced out, and then later I'll bring the letters and numbers closer together so that they have to have that image fall on it as they say it. And as we work on that, now their fixation becomes more stable.
All right. Where do you get the colored filters?
So I don't want to speak to that. I actually get mine from a company in England, which I really like. But I know that there are a number of places online that certainly talk about having these overlays. And I would look to some of those and see if they have the colors that you think might be useful. Some people know about the Irlen system, IRLEN. I know they have some, but there are other companies that have come out with them. Some of them are not even full pages. There's a couple of companies that have put out these strips. They kind of look like small rulers, and they have colors. Some of them are in a strip within the strip so that you can put it right over a line of print. Some are a little larger, and you just put that over the sheet of paper. What we've done sometimes is if we find a color that's helpful, I will also draw with a marker. I will draw a line, a straight line on the piece of colored filter as well, so that as they move down the page, they can keep that line underneath each line of print at the same time that they have the color over the page.
And I can
And I
chime
have
in there to
no,
tell you.
I have
Yeah, I was
no interest financially in any particular company, but I know there are a number of them out there.
And I can chime in there to tell you that, yes, you can find them at Therapro too.
At where?
Let's see. At Therapro.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't realize you guys had them. Great.
We do. Yeah, we have a
Pro
full
has them.
page.
They have
We
everything. They're
do.
great.
Yes. Do you have a list of functional behavioral optometrists that do the things that you spoke about? And this might be more of a regional question, but
So it depends where you live, but one of the things to do is to go to the website COVD.org. It stands for the College of Optometrists in Vision Development. They have recently changed their name, but the COVD.org website is still active. And when you go there, it may take you to their new website, but in any case, there's a doctor finder there. And so you can put in your zip code and you can say, I want someone within 10 miles, 20 miles, 50 miles. There's a few choices there. And once you get the names, then if you obviously aren't familiar with them, you could certainly call an office and talk with them about the particular person you want to refer, because some may work more with children, some very young children, some maybe work more with adults. And, you want to find out what's available. There also are some offices that offer some online treatment for patients that just don't have anyone near them. We know that that's not quite the same as having it in office, but for those that are in more rural areas where there may not be anyone, that may be an option. And that's something you can ask any office that you call, even if it's a fair distance away.
right. Next question. What are some simple exercises we can do to improve visual magnocellular function?
So the basic thing is that when I have someone looking at something, I want to know as they're looking at it, what they notice around it. So for example, if you're looking at this last slide, and I say to you, I want you to look at that letter Y, but I want you to look at it so hard that you see the Y, but you really don't see anything around it. And then I want you to try what I call more soft looking. I want you to look at the Y, it will be clear, but at the same time, I want you to tell me, what do you notice around it? If I look very, very hard at that Y, really hard, I can hardly see any letters to either side of it. But if I soften my looking, I can identify the Y and I will notice other things around it. I may or may not be able to tell you what the other letters are, because if they're small, it may turn out that that part of the visual system doesn't have the ability for that higher resolution, but I can certainly tell you there's something there. The area that we can see clearly is very, very small. And very shortly thereafter, anything that falls a little bit to the right or left of that area, or up or down from that area, the resolution ability of the retina drops off pretty quickly. So it has to be larger if it's more peripheral for us to identify it, but it doesn't mean we can't know it's there and then turn our eyes or our head and eyes to identify it more. The key is to teach someone to look more softly and to get them to notice what's around where they're looking. And that's a way of getting them to use that magnocellular system. It could be looking directly at something and noticing it. It could be that they're looking straight ahead, and as they're walking, let's say they're walking in a straight line, you may put some objects on the floor, and maybe you say to them, I want you to just point at each object as you notice it. Because I always say to everyone, you can only look at one thing at a time, but you can notice more than one thing at a time. So if I'm walking in a straight line, it would be good for me to know if there's something next to my foot that I might trip on. So if I put some objects down on the floor, not too tiny, because again, the resolution in that system is not that high. But if I put some objects on the floor and I space them out and I say, as you're walking, every time you notice, I want you to stop, or I want you to point at it as you go. Now, the pointing part is interesting, because then they have to motor plan, because they can't get to it with their foot and point at that exact moment, or they're going to already be past it. They have to know just before they're noticing it, and that it's somewhat in their periphery, that they're coming up to it, and then they can point. But if they don't plan it out right, they're going to be off. So those are simple things that you can do. We sometimes put a letter or a number or something on a wall, and we say to somebody, or even on a chalkboard, and I say, I want you to look at it. But then maybe in a clockwise fashion, I write some larger, slightly larger numbers or letters around it, either relatively close to what they're looking at or ultimately spacing it out farther. And while they're looking at that central letter or number, I want them to tell me, where's the letter A? Where's the letter B? Where's the letter C? Now remember, those letters in the periphery have to be a little bit larger from a resolution standpoint. But can they find them and identify them while they're looking straight ahead?
Very good. All right, so next question. We have a 7-year-old who reads well when a ruler is used to read by line. However, if a ruler is not used, he reads words from one line and then jumps to another line and continues reading. Is this common in his age, and what can be done to improve his reading?
It's a 7-year-old, you said?
7-year-old.
Yeah,
Yes, 7.
a 7, they should have, boys and girls should have that ability to a pretty good level. From a standpoint of some accommodation, you can try increasing the spacing between the lines. You may, rather than having the full ruler there, maybe have them just place a finger at each end of the lines and have to, again, be aware of their finger peripherally so they can move it down line by line, at least to get them to, again, be more aware peripherally. But as an accommodation, I would extend the spacing between the lines, and that often is helpful. Making it larger is not always helpful. You have to do a lot more scanning, and you get less real estate per scan. So it's not always the best way. I generally try to keep the print on the side of whatever is appropriate for that age, but extend the spacing. And that seems to help a lot.
Very good. All right. How does nystagmus impact vision, including reading and writing?
So nystagmus is an involuntary movement of the eyes. If you look at someone with nystagmus, their eyes will be darting back and forth, for which they have no control. But every person who has nystagmus has something we call a null point. If they turn their head in a certain position, and it's different for each person, they may find, for example, if they turn their head left and tip their chin down a little bit, that's where the nystagmus is the least. The movement is the least, and that's where they can read and follow most easily. They don't realize their eyes are moving. They will not necessarily tell you that things in the real world are moving, but there is a certain instability there that can make it hard when you have connected text. And so one of the main things is to allow them to put their head in that null point. I know that I've had students where they get kind of yelled at because, their head isn't straight and they're not looking directly at the book, but they may need to have their head in some unusual position to dampen the nystagmus and allow them to get through the material. And that's a big thing that most people don't know, is that they have that null point.
Very good. All right. Besides the use of colored overlays, changing fonts, margins, and spacing, and flashing techniques, what are some treatment ideas to enhance magnocellular sensitivity in the school setting?
Say that again. I didn't catch the end of that.
Okay. Besides the use of colored overlays, changing fonts, margins, and spacing, and flashing techniques, what are some treatment ideas to enhance magnocellular sensitivity in the school setting?
Well, I think it's a challenge to do some of the kinds of things that obviously we can do in a vision therapy program. There are many, many different techniques and procedures and instruments and things that we use. But I do think that one of the things is that today, not only are students who are struggling probably have that parvocellular look, in the sense that they don't see much around wherever they're looking, but I think that everyone is spending way too much time on screens and tablets where they also don't have to do that. So some of the things can be simple games and activities that really force someone to be able to notice things happening peripherally that they then have to turn and look to make more clear. Now, in the beginning, that can be things with motion, because that's what that magnocellular system responds to. And then over time, it can be objects or things in the periphery that are stationary, but for which they can still notice them while they're looking, let's say, straight ahead. There can be things in the periphery that they notice. One of the ways that I kind of describe that is, if you want to raise your hand in a classroom and you want the teacher to notice you, you should wave your hand back and forth a little bit, because their peripheral system, that magnocellular system, is much more sensitive to motion than if your arm is just up in the air. And how many objects can they be aware of and deal with at once? I have some patients, if you start with 2 things, it's hard for them. But over time, we're able to add more objects to the picture and have them identify them or reach out and touch them. And that can be things that they're interested in, so that they have some awareness. Or it can be things that they don't know as well, but again, can at least know that they're out there. If you don't want it to have sort of a language component in the beginning, it can just be colored dots that they have to notice. But what you want is an ability for them to be looking in one place and noticing in another.
All right, very good. Let's take one more and then we'll call it a night. I have an 8-year-old autism ADHD client who does not recognize any uppercase or lowercase letters, but can write his name from memory and repetition. I'm not sure how to address the phonics, letter recognition, and progress with reading. Any ideas would be helpful.
Well, I think that's probably an hour and a half talk all by itself, but I do think that if someone has learned to write their name, how are they having that picture? So if they can't recognize letters individually, but they certainly have learned to write their name from some opportunity for understanding how to make the letters and how they go together in a proper order, maybe it's beginning, instead of letters and numbers, maybe beginning with some kind of words, also with that motor action, saying it at the same time, and bringing together all those sensory systems to get them to become familiar with seeing those kinds of things. Now, that being said, I have seen children on the spectrum who are incredible readers. They can read faster than I can read. I can hardly keep up with them when they're reading. But when they get done, they have no idea what they've read. So part of it is also having some ability for picturing things. And you can work on that aspect as well. So it can be a picture of a tank, and then eventually maybe they can connect it with the letter T. But I do think that if they've learned to write their name, and maybe it took a while and a lot of repetition, can you begin with simple, let's say 3-letter words that have something concrete about them? For example, I wouldn't use the or and. I would use cat or dog, or things they're familiar with, and maybe they can learn them in the same realm that they've learned their name. The question is, once they write their name, if you took that paper away for 10 minutes and brought it back, would they recognize their name and be able to tell you what they're looking at? I don't have the answer to that, but that's another piece you may have to look at.
All right. All right. Thank you again for presenting, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great night.